Are we asleep? Let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. Okay, well, at least you faked it. That's fine. All right, let's stand up together. We're going to sing some songs before we get into our Bible study. Is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, and his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. Shall come with trumpet sound. Oh, may I then in him be found. Trust in his righteousness alone. Flawless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. On Christ the solid rock I stand. Sinking sand, all other ground is sinking sand, all other ground is sinking sand. In Christ alone, my hope is found. He is my light, my strength, my song. This cornerstone, this solid ground, firm through the fiercest drought and storm. What heights of love, what depths of peace, when fears are stilled, when striving cease. My comforter, my all in all, here in the love of Christ in Christ alone, who took on flesh, fullness of God in helpless babe, this gift of love and righteousness, scorned by the ones he came to save, till on that cross as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied, till every sin on him was laid. Here in the death of Christ I live. There in the ground his body lay, light of the world by darkness slain, then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again. And as he stands in victory, since curse has lost its grip on me, for I am his and he is mine. in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ I'll stand. Amen. Y'all can be seated.
Open your Bibles tonight to Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21. Well, it's an interesting lesson tonight. Last week, we looked at the Ten Commandments. Moses is up on the mountain, and I shared with you last week, it is kind of forgotten that while he was up on the mountain, that God gave him more than the Ten Commandments. And so we're going to look at, or begin to look at, the rest of the law tonight. It's all based on the Ten Commandments. Those are the big ones, but there are laws concerning everything, all kinds of things. You would think, how much trouble could they get in out in the desert? How many laws could you possibly break out there? Well, quite a lot, actually. And when you're talking about millions of people, you would think they were all, doing good and respectable and respectful, but that's not actually the case. Some of their folks are no different than our folks, and in fact, some ways they're maybe even worse. And so we're going to look at that tonight. It is, when you talk about writing a law, a comprehensive law for an entire nation, you have to deal with some very unseemly things, and we're going to look at things that will shock you tonight. But some of it, much of it, is very sensible, reasonable, and understandable that there would need to be clear laws surrounding certain things. So Exodus chapter 21 and 22 tonight. I don't know how long this will take for us to get, maybe very brief, and it may be longer. But we'll stop whenever we get to the end of chapter 22. Exodus chapter 21, and again, here is Moses receiving the law from God. These are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Awl or owl? Awl. Then he will be his servant for life. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she's not to go free as men servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Well, you say, and rightly so, most of these laws just don't apply today. Now, there are some good principles here, but most of them don't apply today that I've just shared. We'll get into laws that do apply and are more timeless in a minute. But these are laws about servants. Again, I'm using the Bible exposition commentary for the Old Testament for my material tonight primarily. Though the Jews were permitted to own slaves from other nations, usually prisoners of war, they were not allowed to enslave their own people. Two scenarios are presented here: a man who voluntarily becomes a servant, and a woman who is sold to be a servant. If because of poverty a Jew had become an indentured servant, his master had to treat him humanely and release him after 6 years of service. If because of family affection the man wanted to remain in service and the judges approved it, then he would be marked in the earlobe and remain a servant for the rest of his life. However, he was never to be treated as a slave. So all of these laws, and we're talking about slavery. Obviously, if we were to write laws about slavery for 2020, it would just be one sentence long: no slavery. But 3,500 years ago, in a world where there was slavery in most countries to some extent, laws had to be written for it. And in these laws, many of them deal with not slaves that were procured from a war, but slaves that were people who chose to go into slavery because of a debt. So if you wanted to buy a fancy new camel and you couldn't afford it, you would go into debt. You didn't get a credit card, you became a servant for 6 years, and then you were released on the 7th, which is about the length of a note for a new Ford F-150 now, 6 years. So that's just how they did it. And you could voluntarily choose to become a slave or a servant, but not for life. It was a set time. However, because we're not robots, we're people, if while you're in your master's house for that 6 years, you meet somebody, and or the master, you're single, the master that you work for thinks, man, he's single, well, let's get him a wife. And so the master gets him a wife, and he has kids with his wife that the master gave him. When he is released after 6 years, he can go, but he can't take his wife and his kids with him. Isn't that interesting? But if he wants to stay, they go down before the judges, he gets his ear pierced, and he's a member of the family for life. So that's law 3,500 years ago. A female servant wasn't necessarily or automatically set free after 6 years. If a poor man sold his daughter to be a servant or a concubine, then the girl's father would receive the sale price. The girl would get a better home, and her husband wouldn't have to pay a costly dowry. If after becoming the man's concubine she didn't please him, somebody in her birth family could redeem her, and she would be set free. If the man had chosen her for his son, that is, she's a servant, and he thinks, well, this servant girl will make a good wife for my boy, and the son came to dislike her and married another woman, then the son's father had to be sure she was treated like a married daughter, not like a slave. That meant making sure she had clothing, food, and her conjugal rights. And we see this in other places in the Bible referred to. If the father failed to do this, the woman was free to return to her family home and was not considered a slave. And so again, you had to have all of these laws in place to consider the what-if scenario for whatever might happen. Verse 12. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death. However, if he does not do it intentionally, but God lets it happen, he is to flee to a place I will designate. But if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death. Anyone who attacks his father or his mother must be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. Anyone who curses his father or mother must be put to death. Now, here we're talking about capital punishment crimes. We have capital punishment crimes in our society, in our world today, and there are certain things then, there are certain things now for which people can be executed for, and there are some things that they can be executed for in this country, but not in another country, or vice versa, differing laws. And so here are the capital punishment laws in a nutshell. They are the logical, by the way, the logical application of the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. We are made in God's image, so to murder a fellow human being is to attack the image of God. If a person was found guilty of murder on the testimony of two or more witnesses, and we're going to find that out in Numbers 35, then the murderer was killed. The law made a distinction between premeditated murder and accidental manslaughter, which is interesting because there's a distinction made today, this very day. Intent was important then as it is now. If you killed somebody accidentally, you could flee to God's altar for safety. That's 1 Kings chapter 2:29, and it's referred to here as well, until the elders had time to study the matter. Once Israel was in their land, they set apart 6 cities of refuge where the manslayer could flee and be protected until the matter had been investigated. Israel did not have a police force. The family of the victim was expected to see that justice was done. But in the heat of anger, they might be more interested in revenge than in justice, so the law stepped in to protect the accused until he was proved guilty. And again, we have a similar concept in our country of innocent until proven guilty. And so justice didn't come so much through the police, but through the judges. All right, now in the midst of that, there's an interesting reference or two about the relationship that children are to have with their parents. Now, you're all children, and many of you, or most of you here, are also parents, and so you see how this will apply both ways. But in verse 15 and verse 17, having dealt with murder in general, the law then dealt with specific cases. And the first deals with a man's mistreatment of his parents, abusing them physically and or verbally, which would be a violation of the 5th commandment. And it is possible that the prodigal son law in verse 18 applies here, and that this, in chapter 21, verse 18, applies here, and that his son was desperately in need of discipline. Children who have no respect for their parents usually have no respect for any other authority and want only their own selfish way. Without natural affection, in 2 Timothy 3:3 describes some people in these last days, but those kinds of people lived in Moses' day. Do you know what he's talking about? There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be rude and disobedient, and he goes on down the list, and lovers of money, crude, rash, and one of the descriptions of people being so evil in the last day is they will be disobedient to their parents. Well, they're already having a problem with it 3,500 years ago, disobedient to their parents. And if you were disobedient to your parent, the logic was, if you won't submit to the authority of your parents, you're not going to submit to any authority. If you're not going to submit to any authority, you're a detriment to the community and to the nation, and you need to die. If we applied that, and we're not, but if we applied that in 21st century America, how many would die immediately? It would be a shocking number. Now, this sounds cruel, and I don't know how often they actually did this. I don't have any numbers for you, but this was the law. If you were a rotten kid, then it was reasonable for you to die. If you were terrible to your parents, you were a terrible son or a terrible daughter, it was for the best that you died. So as a result, it would keep the community and the nation pure. We don't kill them anymore, and I'm thankful that my parents couldn't kill me by the grace of God. But there is an important principle here, and that is they considered submission to your parents of utmost priority, of utmost importance, something that we lose over the centuries or have lost. Also, kidnapping is prohibited. Did you notice that? It is wrong to steal property, but it's even a greater crime to steal people made in God's image and to sell them as slaves. And if I can go back to that, Verse 16 says, this is in the middle of the relationship of a child to their parents. Verse 16 says, anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he's caught must be put to death. So they took kidnapping very seriously. You couldn't just walk along one day and think, that person would make a good slave. I'll just take them into bondage. I'm bigger than they are, and they're going to serve me. That was a crime that would result in your execution. It was worthy of death, so no kidnapping. All right, any comments or thoughts about that? Yes?
How did the kidnapping thing mesh with a parent selling their kid into slavery?
Well, obviously, I have to look back. I don't know what the age limit was for a kid. I know the age limit was different for a kid then, who's a child, who's an adult, than it is today. And I know we've talked about this before. Today, though we don't have children and we have adults, we have children, teenagers, and adults. We have created that designation, and I remember telling you that came from a magazine article in 1939 where the word teenager was first used. And until then, it was basically a young person and adult. And your responsibility as a parent, you had a singular responsibility for your child, and it was not to entertain the child or take them on great vacations or to buy them the new shoes or all those kinds of things. Your sole responsibility was to prepare them for adulthood. That's what you did. And that's what my great-great-grandparents did, and on back, that they had children, and for the first 12 years or 14 years or however long they're home, it was an understanding between the child and the adult that the function of the adult who had authority over the child was to prepare that child for adulthood. So it has changed, and we have that priority. I like to think that I'm preparing my children for adulthood, but in the middle of that, we spend a lot of time trying to entertain them. You know, buying them the foods that they like and take them to the places that they like. And how many times have I been to Chuck E. Cheese? You know, and so we muddle in all these other things, and I'm not anti-Chuck E. Cheese. Well, I don't really care to go back, but at the same time, I forgot where I was going with that, but we have a responsibility to prepare them for adulthood, because your kids and my kids, and you know this, if they become an adult and they're terrible adults, then we've just wasted our time. No matter how many great memories they have, if they're terrible adults, it was for nothing. No matter what we gave them, how good the gifts were, birthday and Christmas and all those kinds of things, it was all a waste of time if they're no good when they grow up. And so we spend a lot of our attention and emphasis on the wrong things with children. And again, that's a preachery thing to say, but it's true. And I'm guilty. You know, Cherry and I talk about it quite often. You know, we're at this point right now where it's pretty much too late, because I've got an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old, and we hope to goodness they make good decisions and that they're turned out to be good people, and we like them. They're pretty good people. So they're going to move out of the house in the next year. We'll just have the 14-year-old, and we're going to double up on him and really, so maybe we'll really get it right on the third one, you know. But, okay, all right, I'm off track. Children and parents. So, yes, what was the question? I forgot.
Just how did the selling your child into slavery, how was that not?
Yeah, I can imagine that conversation. Come in here, son. I got something to tell you. I don't know. I don't know the answer. Obviously, they were allowed to do that. And, of course, it was always with a time limit. They could only do that for so long, for 6 years, and they had to be released on the 7th year, which, by the way, is an interesting concept for slavery. That is, for being a servant, there was a time limit. And in order to get a slave, as I said a while ago, if you kidnap somebody, it was punishable by what? Death. So all the African Americans that were brought to America, and we enslaved them, or we didn't, but our forefathers did. Were they brought here? We kidnapped every one of them. And it's odd that, that we would do that. I say we, not me, but my ancestors and your ancestors, that they chose to do that because this is clearly wrong. When they went to Africa, we didn't go there to conquer the land or to create cities or to make a better life for everybody there. Went there for the sole purpose of kidnapping people to bring them over to be slaves. And that's prohibited in God's word. So when we talk about slavery in the Bible, it's really a very different thing than slavery in our history. I wouldn't recommend either one, and I'm glad that we've grown past that all the way around. Verse 18, if men quarrel and one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but is confined to bed, then the one who struck the blow will not be held responsible if the other gets up and walks around outside with his staff. However, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he is completely healed. Now, before I get into this section, back then, there weren't a whole lot of ways you could harm somebody. You know, they didn't have a lot of weapons. We have all kinds of great weapons now that they didn't have back then. Basically, they had a rock or a stick. You could hit them with one of those two things. And he says, if you hit somebody with a rock or with your fist, and he doesn't die, he's confined to bed, but he gets up in the next few days, he's walking around with a stick, with a staff, then it's one thing. If he don't get up, then it's another thing altogether. If he does get up, he must pay the injured man for the loss of his time and see that he is completely healed. And so if he's not completely healed, if there's permanent injury, then it's another matter. Verse 20. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished. But he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. So you could hit your slave as long as they recovered, apparently, in a couple days. Verse 22, if men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, this passage was used and misused in the New Testament time, and Jesus had to deal with this. When he's talking about justice here, what he is saying is the crime, or the punishment should fit the crime. And that's reasonable. So if you were to cut off somebody's hand, you don't get both of your hands cut off, only one. Or, you poke out somebody's eye, you don't get both eyes poked out, or no eyes poked out. It should be a proportional punishment. Now, we don't poke all eyes here in the States, and we don't cut off hands, but we do have a system that's very similar to this, because when you go to court, it is the intention of the judge and the jury to make sure that the penalty fits the crime. Not worse and not easier, justice is served. And we hear that term a lot. Justice was not served in this case. What they mean was the punishment didn't fit the crime. Justice is, you do this, you get this. No more and no less. All right. So then they talk about the men, if men are in a fight and somebody smacks a pregnant woman, and what do you do about that? So I don't know, is that a big issue? Again, they're trying to be as comprehensive as possible so that this is already being dealt with ahead of time. Verse 26, if a man hits a maidservant or a manservant in the eye and destroys it, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of a manservant or maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. This principle has been severely criticized by some as being barbaric, but it's actually just the opposite. In an age where the legal system was developing, this law made sure that the punishment meted out by the judges was equal to the seriousness and severity of the crime, not more, not less. If the guilty aggressor blinded his enemy's eye, then his own eye was blinded. Nothing could be fairer. Barbaric, yes, but fair. If you broke your enemy's finger and the court ordered you to be blinded, that would not be fair at all because the sentence must fit the crime. The only time this principle was not enforced was when a master injured a slave and the slave's compensation was his or her freedom. Interesting. All right, any comments about that? Oh, good, let's go forward. Verse 28. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, and again, this is not a big problem here in the 21st century, but apparently it happened then. If a bull gores a man or a woman to death, the bull must be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring and the owner has been warned but has not kept it pinned up and it kills a man or a woman, the bull must be stoned and the owner also must be put to death. However, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned. Again, don't ask me why. But before I go on, again, we don't have bulls goring people a whole lot, but there is a principle here that does apply, that we do encounter. What is it? Your animals are your responsibility. So if you have a pit bull or a Doberman or whatever dog, and your dog attacks somebody else, and you don't have it on a leash, or et cetera, you're responsible to some extent for the behavior of your animal. If your animal does that once, then there's a certain repercussion in the law. But if your animal ends up attacking a child or another person and injuring them or killing them, and it turns out that this incident has happened multiple times before with you because you don't leash your dogs, then there's a whole new punishment level for that crime. It's the same principle. Different animal, but the same principle. Verse 33, if a man uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must pay for the loss. He must pay its owner, and the dead animal will be his. If a man's bull injures the bull of another and it dies, they're to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, a habitual gorer, yet the owner did not keep it pinned up, the owner must pay animal for animal, and the dead animal will be his. Isn't that interesting? All right, with that, chapter 22. Any comments before we go to chapter 22? All right, it just gets worse. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. Verse 3, but if it happens after sunrise, he's guilty of bloodshed. A thief must certainly make restitution, but if he has nothing, he must be sold to pay for his theft. So here's the rule of thumb. If a guy breaks into your house at night, you can kill him. The stand your ground law applies. But if he breaks in during the daytime, you can't kill him. Why not? Do what? So I think I would just break in during the daytime if I was going to be a thief back then. This law also made a difference between the night thief and the day thief. In the daylight, the owner could identify the thief breaking into his pens and could even call for help from his neighbors. To kill the thief in daylight would be an unnecessary expression of revenge. But at night, the owner might not be able to identify the intruder, nor would he know if the man was armed, and therefore his own life was in danger. At night, it would also take longer to get help. And so that's why you could kill him at night, and you couldn't during the day. Isn't that interesting? Again, that is ancient, but we still struggle with the challenge of stand your ground laws all the time. Somebody breaks into a house, in many scenarios, if they get killed, they get killed. But in some scenarios, if they get killed, it's considered murder. It depends upon the case. And what state you're in, yeah. So, it definitely does. Now here in Texas, you're in trouble. If you break into somebody's house. Verse 4, if the stolen animal is found alive in his possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, he must pay back double. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray and they graze in another man's field, he must make restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. Now, again, when Moses receives this law, there are no vineyards, there are no fields, there's no grass because they're in the middle of nowhere, but they're going to be, and so these laws will be in effect for thousands of years. So today, we divide up our property with what? Yeah, we have fences. We didn't have fences back then. The boundaries of fields were marked by stones at the corners and not by fences around the track. Grazing animals wouldn't know one field from another anyway and would wander wherever the grass was available. The owner was supposed to act like a good neighbor and keep watch. If he didn't and his animals ate in his neighbor's field, he had to make restitution in kind to his neighbor, being careful to give him the best, for the restitution shouldn't be something we get away with cheaply. And again, restitution is something that happens quite frequently. All right, any comments about that? Okay, here's a little bit of a long one, so I'm going to read verse 6 through verse 14, and we're going to talk about it. Verse 6 through verse 17, and then we'll talk about it. Verse 6, if a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. If a man gives his neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if he's caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges to determine whether he has laid his hands on the other man's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which someone says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to his neighbor. If a man gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to his neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. So you understand what's going on here is somebody gives his neighbor his items, his goods, or his animals, and says, I'm going to Hawaii on vacation. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Will you watch over this for me? And he comes back, it's all gone. And the neighbor says, well, it got stolen. Well, maybe it did get stolen, or maybe the neighbor just went in cahoots with the thief who took it. And so this is what they're trying to do. That's all true except for the Hawaii part. They didn't mention that. Verse 13. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, he shall bring in the remains as evidence, and he will not be required to pay for the torn animal. If a man borrows an animal from his neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, he must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. Now, we made a transition there. It just flowed right in. No disrespect. It was just time to move to the next law. Now, ultimately, in chapter 22, beginning in verse 16, if we look at those two verses that I just read, we are talking about what in today's law would be considered rape. Unmarried girls belong to their father, and a girl who was not a virgin would not be sought as a wife, so her loss of virginity meant a loss in bridal price to her father, I know, again, that sounds horrible, but it's not just a personal thing, it's a financial thing. The offender was required to marry the girl, but if the father didn't want him as a son-in-law, and who would want him as a son-in-law, the man could pay the dowry and be set free. If the girl were engaged, the rape was considered adultery and a different law applied. Oh my goodness. Well, that law, and let me restate that. If the girl was engaged, the rape was considered adultery because she's not engaged to that guy, she's engaged to somebody else, and a different law applied. That law is Deuteronomy 22:23. So let me read that to you really quick. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The girl, because she was in town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a girl pledged to be married and he rapes her, now it uses the word rape, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the girl. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders his neighbor, for the man found the girl out in the country, and though the betrothed girl screamed, there was nobody to rescue her. Isn't that interesting? In other words, if she has an affair with a guy, then they both die. If she's being raped, she needs to scream, and somebody will come running. If she's in the country and nobody's around, then she is not punished at all, because if she screams, there's nobody to hear her, and so she's let go, and the guy is is executed for rape. Verse 28, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the girl, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. And so back to our passage for tonight in verse 18. Now he's going to go through a number of miscellaneous laws beginning in verse 18. Do not allow a sorceress to live. Now, it's interesting, in my Bible, and probably in yours, it says sorceress. It's feminine. I can only assume this would apply to a sorcerer as well. Sorcerers or sorceresses were not allowed to live. Why? Do you know? Jews were commanded to stay away from everything that was associated with the occult because it was considered idolatry. So generally, or probably universally, if somebody was a sorcerer or a sorceress, they not only practice magic arts, but they are practicing magic arts in order to glorify a false god, and that deserved death. Verse 19, anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. And I read that, I thought, was that a problem? You have to make a law? Well, you know, people haven't changed that much in all these years. It was a problem then, and believe it or not, I learned it's a problem now. You might think, really? Well, yes, in part because it was also part of the religious practices of the heathen nations and was condemned by the Lord. And so there are nations throughout the world at the time, as a part of their religious festivities, they had sex with animals. I don't know what to tell you. I read one article. I only read one article, by the way. It was enough. 98% of it I can't even repeat. But one article said, human sexual relations with animals have existed since the dawn of human history in every place and culture in the world. Among many disgusting examples, it cites, and I didn't verify this, but this is what the article says, Egyptians even had sex with crocodiles. So the reason I mention that to you is, where did the Israelites come from for 400 years? From Egypt. Now, I don't know how dumb you have to be to look at a crocodile and I'm assuming, I don't know that was a religious thing or something. I don't know. Again, I didn't look it up. That's all I could take. Verse 20, whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. So now we just get right to the idolatry itself. Idolatry was Israel's greatest temptation during their wilderness journey, as well as after they entered the promised land. And throughout the Old Testament, it comes up over and over and over and over again, idolatry. So God warned them to destroy the pagan temples and altars as soon as they got into the promised land, because he knew that they would be tempted to go astray. Unfortunately, what we see so many times in their history, for example, in the day of Jeremiah, who prophesied that God was going to allow Nebuchadnezzar to come in and destroy Jerusalem, which he did, destroyed the temple, which he did. And he warned them because the Israelites were openly worshiping other gods. And legally, they should have all been executed for their crimes. But it was openly accepted, even though it was forbidden. Why? I don't know. But they chose to simply worship other gods. Now, what they would do, I suspect, from the time, the fact that the temple was being utilized, that they were worshiping God, but they were worshiping other gods as well. They weren't completely renouncing God. They believed and were deceived into believing that they could do both. And again, that is our challenge today in this world, this belief that we can worship God, but we can do these other things and follow after all these false gods, and that's okay. And it is not. Okay, all right, verse 21. Do not mistreat an alien. Now, that's not a UFO alien. That's somebody from another country. Or oppress him, for you were aliens in Egypt. Isn't that an interesting statement? Do not mistreat an alien or oppress him, for you were aliens in Egypt. Now we're going to get into laws of selfishness, and we're about done. Thank goodness. Laws of selfishness. These laws admonish the Jews to be kind to strangers, aliens, widows, and orphans, and the poor. So that was the statement about aliens. Verse 22, do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a money lender. Charge him no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it to him by sunset, because his cloak is the only covering he has for his body. What else will he sleep in? When he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Let me say it again. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people. So do not eat the meat of an animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it to the dogs. Now, he goes through all of these things. Then he gets down to you can't eat your cow if it's being killed by wild animals. Why not? Roadkill's nasty. All right, I didn't hear the other comments, but that's pretty much exactly right. The reason, and I'm reading a commentary here, the reason behind this law is both religious and hygienic. The bodies of animals slaughtered incorrectly would still contain blood, and the eating of blood was forbidden, Leviticus 22:8. Furthermore, a carcass lying in the field could quickly become spoiled and spread disease. Free meat could be very expensive. A holy people wouldn't want to touch it, let alone eat it, which is why you and I don't typically stop our vehicle and scrape something off the highway. Because that's just bad common sense there. All right. Oh, thank goodness. Any comments or additions or confessions? Do what? All right, there you go. Well, it gives you kind of a bird's eye view of the challenges that they had 3,500 years ago, and some of them are different than today, and many of them are not any different than today. We're still lawbreakers, and we still have to have laws. Yeah. All right, any other comments? Still up on the mountain.
So it's right after Jethro saying, hey, you need judges, that God says,
Yeah.
you've got all these judges, that this is what they're for.
Yeah. So Moses goes up on the mountain. Remember, the mountain is filled with smoke and lightning and fire, and Moses has gone up to get the Ten Commandments, and while he's up there, he's also receiving these laws as well. Yeah. Well, that is an excellent question, and I don't know. I truly don't know. He didn't come down with 500 commandments. He only had the 10, but he had to remember that, or God gave him the ability to remember that. And when it was written down is a subject of great debate. Moses is attributed to writing the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. And at what point did he put those in writing, or were they all verbal? That is, there was an oral tradition of the law of God taught through Moses, and at some point they were written down, but if so, when? And so that's of debate as to when, but we do know that the who. And so it's a good question. I don't know. Ask me in 100 years, I'll tell you. All right, anything else? All right, let's take a look at our prayer sheet for the week, and then we'll be dismissed.